Welcome to another edition of Exploring America's Founding Documents. And this month we are celebrating Pride Month. And not only are we celebrating Pride Month, but it's also Immigrant Month, Immigrant Heritage Month. It is also Juneteenth this weekend, the holiday celebrating the emancipation of enslaved people. And so it's just a packed full month of celebration here in June. It's also the month of my birth, so it feels very appropriate to be celebrating that way. Because, you know, my birthday is totally on the same level as those other things, right? Right. But this program in particular is focusing on Pride Month because we are talking about two rights that are fundamental to LGBTQ people's basically legal foundation to exist in this country. And as a member of that community, I absolutely celebrate and thank goodness for these rights, despite the fact they have not always been interpreted in a way that has been beneficial for my community and other communities. But, you know, the country is a work in progress, and so is the Constitution, so we're working on it. I should also mention that my usual habit is to live stream this event on our library Facebook page. But I'm not going to do that this month because things are a little bit different at my house this month. It's just a little bit complicated with my space. So I am recording it and I will post it later. So if you are joining us live, which at the moment nobody is, so that's okay. Just know this is being recorded if you do join us. And later on, folks who are not able to join us can view this whole thing. And I will try to keep it brief and full of interesting information. And I'm really appreciated that those live streams, which get saved on our library Facebook page at Penyon Public Library's Facebook page, get a lot of views after we're done with the program every month. So I appreciate everybody who takes a minute to watch at least some of these videos and learn a little bit about our founding documents. I hope you sit down and write out the laws or the clauses or whatever it is we're looking at each month and take some time to think about what they mean to you, what they mean to our society. So we're getting into the rights to privacy and association and how those are established in our system. But as usual, I would like to start with our land acknowledgement. We would like to acknowledge with respect that Penyon Public Library sits on the ancestral lands and waterways of the Haudenosaunee people. All of our work, services, and programs occur on land that was cared for and called home by the Haudenosaunee for over 1,000 years. Yates County is part of a region that remains home to the Haudenosaunee. We acknowledge the ongoing history of dispossession at work here and are grateful to live, work, and share experiences like this one on these lands. Thank you for acknowledging that with me. So the rights to association and privacy, much like the rights, a lot of different rights for a lot of different people, depend on a conception of the Constitution as a living document. And I know that in the world of jurisprudence, if you follow that rip-roaring topic closely, you know that there is some debate among judges and legal scholars about this. You know, is the Constitution a living organism that should adapt and be reinterpreted with time, or is it intended exactly as the framers wrote it, and it should be interpreted as such very strictly with the words as they had meaning in the 18th century kept in mind? Big question. For the purposes of our discussion here today, I think we really need to acknowledge that the Constitution has to be a living document. If the Constitution were meant to be taken literally and exactly as written and intended over 200 years ago, pretty much everything we're talking about today would be moot. That concept, the fact that the idea that the Constitution might be taken literally and exactly as written, would leave the vast majority of humanity as subordinate to a small privileged class. And so I'm confident in saying that view is total bunk. I think that most leading legal scholars today would agree with that position. The very fact that we have amendments to the Constitution should kind of tell you which way even the founders were leaning on the question. The Constitution is meant to change and evolve and adapt. And LGBTQ plus people like me, women, Black people and other people of color, Indigenous people, and many more are all permitted to participate more fully in our society, to pursue happiness, to use that term that gets bandied about so much by patriots, because the idea of a living and evolving constitution is embraced by most scholars, jurists, and so on. And for that, I say thanks for nothing, strict constructionists, because the way you interpret things does not leave much room for someone like me to pursue happiness in our society. So I'm grateful that that is not always the prevailing view, and I think a lot of other people are as well. Sorry if you're a strict constructionist, you might not be super happy with the rest of this discussion if you are. So we're talking about the history of LGBTQ people. That goes hand in hand with the discussion of the rights of LGBTQ people. And I know I've got 2 pages that look like this, and I know it looks like a lot, but let me just fly through it quickly. It is Pride Month, and it is important to acknowledge where we've been, how we've struggled, and where we are going. So of course, the history of LGBTQ people stretches back until the beginning of their being people. We have always existed. We are not a modern invention. We are not something that has sprung up out of some sort of, byproduct of a pluralistic society. We're natural. We're a part of the world as it exists. We're a part of society. The only reason someone might think that we're not is because for so much of that time, people in power and positions of authority have looked on us with disfavor. Anything that is different is often looked on with disfavor. And so we have been marginalized, pushed to the edges, forced into the closets. And it is only very recently that there has been concerted efforts for us to claim our rights and our standing in society. So we're going to look back to 1950 when the first organization to push for social acceptance for gay people was founded. That was known as the Mattachine Society. And throughout the 50s and 60s, leading from that example, a number of different societies focused in different cities and areas of the country came to the fore, or maybe focused on different identities. There were some societies dedicated to rights and acceptance for lesbians, for example. But anytime there's a step forward, there are steps backwards. So in 1952, you see the American Psychological Association designate homosexuality a mental illness. In the DSM, their diagnostic and statistical manual that sort of lays out what is mental illness and what is not. If you're a psychiatrist, psychologist, or you studied any of that sort of thing, that'll be very familiar to you. There's just a big manual that says if you exhibit these characteristics, you have some kind of a mental illness. And from 1952 until sometime later, homosexuality was a part of that. In 1953, President Eisenhower codified gay people as a security risk. This was all part of the Red Scare. There was a perception that gay people would be, we would sort of maybe be a little more open to working with the Soviets, betraying our country. And in fact, as most people were in the middle of the century, the baseline was patriotism. The baseline was support for the country you live in and support for the institutions around you. And that was no different for LGBTQ people. But it's telling that the government would perceive us as a security threat, perhaps sensing, gosh, they might have reason to be upset with us. And rather than addressing the reasons we might be upset with them, they decided, well, okay, the Soviets are probably going to try to get into their heads and use them against us, so they might be a security risk. Just another way of marginalizing us. But steps forward do happen. So in 1961, Illinois became the first state to go through a process of decriminalizing homosexuality by repealing sodomy laws. And we'll talk a little bit more about how this plays into the constitutional rights we're talking about a little bit later. And then you get a big watershed moment and the reason why we celebrate Pride in June, and that is the June 28th, 1969 Stonewall riot, which effectively launched the LGBTQ plus rights movement. And 1 year later, the New York City LGBTQ community organized the first Pride parade to commemorate that riot, and it was a riot. If you're not familiar with the story of Stonewall, it has to do with LGBTQ people, many of them people who would probably today identify as trans, many of them people of color, just trying to, enjoy themselves, be amongst people like themselves at a bar in Lower Manhattan, the Stonewall Inn, just trying to associate freely as they wish, and faced harassment from police who were widely known to be on the payroll of the mafia, in fact. So it's not just like, oh, the police were just going around trying to do their duty and stopping, what was perceived as negative activities. No, it was part of, a protection racket and in built-in stigma associated with LGBTQ people. They raided the Stonewall Inn, put people in paddy wagons, and a bottle was thrown and a riot started, and that was Stonewall. And sometimes you have to take your rights if you're not being given them. 1973, Lambda Legal, the first legal organization fighting for equal rights for gays and lesbians, was formed. And in that same year, Maryland became the first state to statutorily ban gay marriage. So up until that point, there was no law against gay marriage. It was just assumed that gay people would not try to get married, heaven forbid. But with the gay rights movement gaining steam, states are starting to actually put laws on the books to stop us. But also PFLAG was founded. Parents and Friends, Lesbians, and Gays was the original meaning of that acronym, a very powerful organization showing that not all parents were against their LGBTQ plus identifying children, very powerful step. And the APA votes to remove homosexuality from its list of mental disorders. Yay. 1978, the rainbow flag is introduced as the symbol of our community. 1982, Wisconsin becomes the first state to outlaw discrimination based on sexual orientation. And believe it or not, that is a process going through the states that is not complete yet, and it is not always outlawed to discriminate against people based on that. In 1993, Don't Ask, Don't Tell was signed into law by President Clinton. And later in 1996, he'll sign the Defense of Marriage Act, which defines marriage between one man and one woman. In the early 90s, early to mid 90s, you're really starting to see LGBTQ plus rights take center stage in the culture wars. You had one end of the political spectrum pushing for gay rights, and the other end of the political spectrum seeing that as a threat and pushing back. And those in the middle having to find ways to juggle those two perspectives. And this is certainly not a bright spot in President Clinton's legacy. Continuing on here, 1996, Hawaiian courts determined that the state does not have a legal right to deprive same-sex couples of the right to marry, so things are starting to look better. And unfortunately, just the next year, one of the more dark moments in our history, Matthew Shepard murdered in an anti-gay hate crime. We've been facing violence and threats of violence throughout all of history, as so many other groups have. And sometimes it takes one sort of watershed case to really bring home to people outside the affected community how terrible that is, that it's not something you can just turn your face away from. During the civil rights movement of the 50s and 60s, it was the lynching of Emmett Till, and the images of him in his casket absolutely brutalized in horrific ways by white segregationists from the South really helped awaken the United States to the need for racial justice. In a lot of ways, the Matthew Shepard case plays a similar role in LGBTQ civil rights battles. And if you're not familiar, he was a young man from Wyoming who was beaten to death by two straight men, tied to a fence on the edge of the prairie, and left for dead. And he survived the night, was found the next morning, and died in a hospital. horrible, horrible end to this young man's life. In 2003, the Supreme Court officially decriminalized same-sex sexual conduct, another step towards the right to privacy being codified in a way it had never been before. And so in 2004, the first legal same-sex marriage takes place in Massachusetts. 2011, Don't Ask, Don't Tell is repealed, allowing LGBTQ, well, really gay and lesbian service members to serve openly in the military. That does not apply to transgender members of the military, and that's still an issue that has been this focus of a good deal of controversy. Another big watershed, June 26th, 2015, Happy Pride. The Supreme Court rules that states cannot ban same-sex marriage, which means any of those laws, like the one in Maryland we talked about, that officially codified bans of same-sex marriage into law, were no longer constitutional. It's really great to feel like you finally have another one of the rights that most other people take for granted. Unfortunately, this could easily go back the other way with a conservative Supreme Court, and my right to marry the person I choose wherever I want to in this country might go away. Stay tuned. 2016, the ban on transgender service members is lifted. If you jump down a bit to 2018, you see that the subsequent administration announces a new ban on transgender service members, and then the administration after that repeals it this year. So this is sort of the culture war hot potato of the moment. The Ross and Rachel, will they or won't they ban trans service members from serving in the military? And I say it does not seem very patriotic to advocate for an entire class of people to not be allowed to answer the call they may feel to serve the country. That's just my position on that. But in the meantime, in 2017, an appeals court ruled that the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which is a watershed act in civil rights in general, but particularly in the rights for people of color, it prohibits workplace discrimination against LGBTQ people. And in 2020, the Supreme Court would uphold that finding. So again, up until 2017 and beyond, it was potentially legal for someone to be fired for being gay, lesbian, transgender. And it is only since 2020 that discrimination has been found to be against the Constitution by the Supreme Court. So amazing, right? I mean, I bet a lot of people listening think that, of course, it's, whatever my personal feelings, of course, you can't just fire someone for being gay, geez. But that's only been true very recently, and I'm sure there are still many people fighting against that idea. So as we talk about the rights of gay people and LGBTQ people and how the Constitution guarantees those rights, some people might ask, well, gosh, aren't LGBTQ people just demanding special rights? Isn't it special for two men or two women or two gender nonconforming people to want to get married? Isn't it special for an LGBTQ person to want to adopt children? Isn't it a special right for them to, to make it, to say to an employer that they cannot fire someone for being gay? Well, as the ACLU tells us, and they would know, as the Supreme Court explained in Romer v. Evans, there is nothing special about laws which prevent people from losing jobs and homes because of who they are. Most of us, if you're lucky, take the right to participate in daily life on an equal footing for granted, the court said, either because we already have the right under the law or because we are not subjected to that kind of discrimination. Laws which prohibit discrimination simply give LGBT people that basic right to be equal participants in the communities in which they live. So these amendments form the constitutional basis that guarantees rights to LGBTQ plus people as well as other marginalized groups. So no, it's nothing special. It's just the American dream and American values given meaning. So we're talking about the right to privacy first and what aspects of the Constitution undergird the right to privacy. And we can also think of the right to privacy as the right to be left alone. So if you're following along and you would like to write these out with us, now is your time. We're starting with the Fourth Amendment. So if you're watching subsequently to this, you can pause now. I won't take too much time on this since there's no one with us live, but I'll read this out loud. The Fourth Amendment states the right of the people to be secure in their persons, houses, papers, and effects against unreasonable searches and seizures shall not be violated, and no warrants shall issue but upon probable cause, supported by oath or affirmation, and particularly describing the place to be searched and the persons or things to be seized. And so my snap Alex legal eagle interpretation of this amendment is the authorities cannot get up in your business without a rational reason or reasonable rationale. And ideally, the idea that, quote, because we think you're a sex deviant by our puritanical standards, should not cut it for getting the right to get up in someone's business. In short, what consenting adults do in the privacy of their homes is between them, not between them and the state. So this provides a pretty firm basis for a right to privacy that extends to things like what people do in their bedrooms. You remember in that laundry list of LGBTQ rights, there was the state that struck down sodomy laws, because what people choose to do as consenting adults in the privacy of their homes has nothing to do with the state. We've also got the Fifth Amendment. So again, if you're writing this at home, you can pause here. The Fifth Amendment states, no person shall be held to answer for a capital or otherwise infamous crime unless on a presentiment or indictment of a grand jury, except in cases arising in the land or naval forces or in the militia, when in actual service in time of war or public danger, nor shall any person be subject for the same offense to be twice put in jeopardy of life or limb, nor shall he be compelled in a criminal case to be a witness against himself, nor be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, nor shall private property be taken for public use without just compensation. So part of the significance of the Fifth Amendment is the due process clause, and part of the significance for our purposes is this idea that private property shall not be taken for public use. This is reaffirming the idea that there is such a thing as private away from the sphere of the state, that other rights can be inferred from. And then we have the Ninth Amendment. The enumeration in the Constitution of certain rights shall not be construed to deny or disparage others retained by the people. Basically, this is saying just because it does not appear in the Constitution does not mean a right does not exist. And this has been a very important legal structure in certain time periods. So it's very hard for someone to say, well, it doesn't explicitly say that LGBTQ people have the right not to walk down the street and get stoned, so I guess we can do it. No, we can infer the right of people like me to exist without such treatment exists regardless of its lack of coverage in the Constitution. And finally, the first section of the 14th Amendment tells us all persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States and the state wherein they reside. No state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges or immunities of citizens of the United States, blah, 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 blah. Nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process, nor deny to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws. So add them up and what you get, it's the right to privacy. As the ACLU makes clear, the right to privacy or the right to be left alone is guaranteed by the 4th, 5th, 9th, and 14th Amendments. In 1965, Griswold v. Connecticut struck down a state law that prohibited married couples from obtaining contraceptions, citing zones of privacy. In 1967, Loving v. Virginia decriminalized interracial marriage. That happened in June as well, I should just add. So Loving Day happened a few days ago, and I saw so many beautiful expressions all across my social media of folks telling the stories of their marriages, which would not have been possible before Loving v. Virginia. The 1972 Eisenstadt v. Baird decision recognized unmarried persons' right to contraceptives, and in 1973, Roe v. Wade recognized women's right to reproductive choice. All of these Supreme Court decisions underscore the principle that decisions about intimate relationships are personal and should be left up to the individual. So even though we're talking about LGBTQ rights, you can see how this extends to people far beyond just people in my community. And if we denied the right to privacy, it would affect people in interracial marriages and relationships. It would affect people's ability to obtain contraceptives, and it would affect one's right to choose to have or have not an abortion. So it all kind of hangs together, and you don't really want to let go of one without weakening the foundation for the others. Let's see here. So that's the right to privacy. We're going to also talk about the right to associate, the right to assemble in protest against prevailing norms. And this really comes from one place, and it's our old friend, the First Amendment, which reads, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech or of the press, or of the right to the people to peaceably assemble, emphasis added, and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. So how does this affect LGBTQ plus people? Going back to the ACLU, freedom of speech and association are protected under the First Amendment. This amendment protects the right to organize and urge government to end discrimination, to recognize lesbian and gay relationships, and to adopt laws prohibiting discrimination in the private sector. It also includes the right to form social and political organizations, to socialize in bars and restaurants, to march or protest peacefully, to produce art with gay themes, and to speak out publicly against LGBT issues. This basically says that we do not have to live in the closet. The right to privacy says that we have the right to do various things in our homes. This says that we get to be out in public as LGBTQ people. And this is important. This was what was at stake at the Stonewall riot. The police came down and said, we want you people to disperse. You disgust us, and therefore goodbye. And my community, led by trans women of color primarily, stood up and said, no, we are Americans, we have rights, and we are not going anywhere. And I get that some people might lean heavily on the right to protest peacefully. That's a question for another day about where that line is drawn. But again, sometimes when rights are not being afforded to you and your voice is not being heard, sometimes you got to throw a brick. Sometimes you got to smash a window. And, you might be coming from a place where that is a foreign concept to you, but think about what rights that, if stripped away from you, you would be able to tolerate happily and peacefully, and how long you could go being ignored without stepping forth. But that's another issue, and we're not going to dwell on that for very much longer. We're at 6 o'clock here now, so I'm just going to breeze through this bit quickly. This is from a previous presentation. Okay, so I did not change my presentation. This is from last month, so sorry about that. So we're even closer to being done than I thought, so that's great. But here we have sources and further reading. This is where I drew a lot of my information from. You can pause this here to write down some of these links and look at them on your own if you are interested. But the essential message is, we fight for our rights. Those of us who have struggled the longest under oppression have a lot to be thankful for in 2021, when our rights are at least putatively protected in the courts of law and so forth. But we have to be ever vigilant. Everything is very precarious. Things can be stripped away with a single Supreme Court decision, and that is very scary. And if you are a person who goes through life not fearing that, being insulated by privilege from having some of your essential rights to get together with the people you want to get together with, or to do what you want to do in your own home, or to have children, or to work, or to live. If you don't live in fear of those things being taken away, it might be hard for you to understand this, but I am asking you to put yourself in the shoes of people for whom that is not true, and believe us when we say that it is not true for all of us. And then once you've realized that, live your life accordingly. Be an ally, show up, write to your elected officials, support the library, all those kinds of things. It's a beautiful thing to be fighting for more rights for more people. And keep in mind too, that more rights for LGBTQ people doesn't take anything away from the rights of people who aren't gay and whose religion might have something to say on the matter. In the confines of your mind and conscience, in the walls of your church and at church events, wherever they may be, in your groups where you have the right to assemble, in the institutions that are run by your religious organizations, you know, that's your right to hold those beliefs and to structure your life accordingly. But if you get out into the public sector and you are a religious person, but you are running a cake shop for everybody or a photography studio for everybody, that's just out there on, you've got a storefront on the street or a website out on the World Wide Web. Serving us does not take anything away from you. You can go to church and ask for forgiveness for serving us. But if you're out there, that's the way it's got to be. We have a right to exist. We have a right to avail ourselves of all the services that everyone else does, at least for now, because you never know what'll happen during the next Supreme Court term. And again, I ask you to feel what that might feel like. So thanks, everybody. On that happy note, I'll say happy Pride, and we will end this event. And I hope you learned a little something from this event. Thank you and goodbye.